Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Todd Bernitt, who's VP of Managed Services at Robinson Fresh, which is a division of C.H. Robinson. And today we're going to talk about macro growth in micro supply chains. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's what e-commerce is doing to the retail grocery industry and perishable supply chains. It's driving rapid change, across the industry, which on the one hand is creating challenges for all stakeholders, but on the other hand is creating a lot of opportunities for differentiation and to capture market share. So what are these, some of these challenges and opportunities? What actions do grocery retailers and their perishable supply chain partners take to succeed in this new environment? And what ultimately will separate the leaders from the laggards in this industry? Well, that's going to be the key focus of today's conversation, and it's great to welcome back Todd to the program.
Thank you.
Based on his insights and perspective on this market, to kind of share his view on this. So, Todd, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me back. As you know, I have a face for radio, not for video, so I appreciate you putting me back on. But just to give a little background, so I'm the VP of Services at Robinson Fresh, which is a division of C.H. Robinson. I oversee our managed procurement services, which is a full outsourced platform for retailers and food service folks. Also, their replenishment services, their service center network. I've been with them for going on 27 years now. Most of that time on the fresh fruit side of the business, the perishable side of the business. I do have background with them on the transportation side and logistics. So pretty excited about talking to you today, and a lot of the changes that e-commerce is actually driving in these supply chains. We call it the macro growth of micro supply chains.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's great to have you back. I know the last time you were on the program, we were talking about some of the challenges in the perishable supply chains, and it's an area that I think a lot of us go into the grocery store and kind of see fruits and vegetables and all these types of items. And, when you really think about all the complexity and everything that goes into, getting that product there on time with great quality and so forth, you really appreciate, all the hard work that goes into that. So let's talk now. I mean, you mentioned it. I mentioned it in my opening remarks. You just mentioned it now. Our e-commerce is arguably the biggest transformational force, affecting all industry, and grocery retail and perishable supply chains are really no exception. And, since you have, you gave your background, and you have, broad perspective working with perishable companies on the Robinson Fresh side, and then you also are very involved on the logistics and transportation side on the C.H. Robinson side. I mean, can you comment a little bit about the impact that e-commerce is having on perishable supply chains and grocery retail?
Yeah. So on average, year over year on the retail grocery segment of e-commerce, it's growing at about 35% per year. Massive growth there. The prediction is over the next 2 to 5 years, really all retail grocery, essentially about 70% they're predicting will be purchased online through either an app-based environment or an online type-based environment. So what this means for retail grocery, essentially 70% of the time the consumer is going to have a great experience, a middle of the road experience, or quite possibly not a really good experience. So with all of these changes going on, realistically, market forecasts are that grocery and supply chains, they're outpacing the industry's need to accommodate all these changes. So drastic changes in this growing demand, especially in fresh and perishables. So like I talk to our customers about this market imbalance really isn't a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. It means that market share is up for grabs. All market share is up for grabs. And that's no more evident than in perishable, because realistically, that's what really grabs the experience for the grocery shopper. So all of these things going on in retail and grocery perishable, there's a bunch of micro supply chains going on at this macro level.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can't go kind of a week without picking up the newspaper and seeing, some of the big names in grocery retail and kind of the changes going on there in terms of like you said, e-commerce and all these different, models, because they understand whether it's, delivery of groceries to the home, or whether it's, buy online and then have it ready for you to pick up. And that's having kind of this ripple effect on, not only store operations, but everything behind it in terms of making sure that product is there, at the supermarket, at the grocery store, in the right time, in the right quality, and so forth. So I want to explore a little bit about kind of the title of the episode and what you just mentioned right now. Macro growth of micro supply chains. Can you explain that a little bit? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so I'll kind of break it down into two sections. I'll comment first on micro and macro, and then kind of get in a little bit later on what that actually means. What does that mean? So in today's retail environment, the produce and perishable managers and those folks doing the procurement of that, they're used to what goes on from an ad perspective, when to run watermelons, when to run strawberry ads, when to be in and out of product. They're really a well-oiled machine. And if you think about what's going on with change, and consumers' habits are changing, so we're talking about millennials, Gen Zs, those types of things. Customers really are coming in, they're wanting more pre-prepared type items that would be in meal kits, that's processed type items, that's grab and go, which really, those inventories and supplies run totally different. So it's really kind of this app-based online food service experience at retail. So, and then you add this different component with all of these different suppliers, new packaging, new processing that goes on. It's totally different experience than the traditional brick and mortar style. So really the goal is to have the consumer to have a great experience when they have that, because when they do, you get repeat customers. And with that, perishable, fresh, processed, prepackaged, meal kit type of things, it's instant or near instant inventory, and that inventory has to meet that available demand. Those inventory flows are different, those patterns are different, and really we consider this for retailers a macro challenge. And then secondly, to describe really what this means, I'll kind of break it down into the traditional infrastructure in today's typical brick and mortar environment, which has large capital warehousing infrastructure, large capital dedicated to inventory. And really right now, convenience and time, those are the driving forces behind e-commerce. So, and then when I mentioned geography earlier, I do talk about placement, and that's forward placement of inventory, because fresh and perishable has to have high turns, short shelf life, high demand. And so really what I mean by macro is that your warehousing and inventory flows, that's really the first step to meet this convenience. So additionally, in the past, a commissary may have been thought of a little bit different. In today's retail environment, the store itself can be treated as a commissary in this perishable environment. So to think about current warehousing, so DCs typically don't have the infrastructure to support these quick turns, nor do they have the space to add on to these SKUs. And then you piece into their orders are coming in maybe 10 hours in advance, 12 hours in advance, and they have to meet those POs. On top of that, the shelf life may only be 48 hours or longer, 3 to 5 days. So these goods are moving in a much faster pattern than traditional retail. Inventory has to be held short shelf life. Inventory has to be held closer. And really, you're going to create these micro supply chains around these store groupings. So third-party supply chain partners like us at C.H. Robinson and Robinson Fresh will more than likely need to need to be engaged to have this flexible warehousing and inventory model. So just kind of wrap it all up in terms of what it is and what it means. It's this macro growth of these micro supply chains around these geographies. And what it actually means is you're going to need more, closer, anytime, anywhere to meet the consumer demands. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is, I mean, you see, a lot of the headlines, in recent weeks have been about, the moves that some big players out there are making to make, next day delivery, free next day delivery, and kind of the ripple effect that that's having on, supply chain and distribution networks and so forth. But I think when you think about it from the perishable standpoint, right, it's one thing to create this network where you're going to be delivering, books, or you're delivering electronic gadgets or clothes or something, next day. But when the clock is really, truly ticking on these perishable items, and it's something that, I think people have very different expectations to grocery items and perishable items than they do to, getting a more physical, product that, doesn't have the same characteristics. You realize that when you try to create these micro supply chains, just because of the perishable nature of what you're dealing with, the level of there's much more smaller tolerance for things to go wrong, because you can just have complete spoilage of very expensive product out there if you don't get this right.
And there's nothing worse than having a bad customer experience. It can be easily done with these types of products. So that would be number one. And or when the consumer orders this online or through their app, and from an inventory perspective, it's not there when they either go in to pick it up or when it gets delivered to their car. So that's the real challenge, is to have a really good customer experience when they do get the product, but then more likely to manage inventory upstream. So a lot of these, it's not static inventory, so you're not keeping books in a big warehouse somewhere.
Right.
Press turn type stuff. So some examples of this would be in the real world, some traditional warehousing networks for retail grocers, let's say on a national scope, may have 3 or 4 warehouses spread out in a large geographic pattern. Let's say, 2 out in California, 1 in the Midwest, maybe up in Chicago, and then one East Coast in Pennsylvania. For the most part, e-commerce and these types of companies that are shrinking the distance between inventory, warehousing, and consumer, they'll have a much broader scope of their warehousing network, say 8 different states, and a concentration of maybe 4 to 6 warehouses within those states, because convenience and inventory turn, that's at the heart of what those e-com retailers do. And that has to get filtered into the grocery retail side. So here at Robinson, we do have a large array of third-party warehouses and networks on both the ambient and the perishable side. But one thing to think about when these inventory and warehousing patterns change, it's that product inventories, they're being spread out in different origin and destination pairs. So from the logistics side, traditionally, when I talked about that initial warehousing network, you could manage freight from California into, say, Illinois or Pennsylvania. Well, with these non-static warehouses and perishable warehouses and these closer, more dense geographies, the whole logistical patterns, it's just going to change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that always, I think more and more companies are starting to recognize is, there's a lot of discussion over the past couple of years about digital transformation. And a lot of that discussion has been more on the IT side in terms of, companies needing to modernize and upgrade their IT capabilities in order to keep up with all these things that we're talking about, e-commerce and changing consumer expectations and so forth. But the reality is, and I wrote about this on Talking Logistics, last year, is that all of this is also having a physical transformation, right? So you're having to transform the distribution and transportation networks as well in order to meet these changing requirements. So from a logistics and transportation perspective, I mean, you just talked about, kind of the changes that need to take place from a, kind of a network, a DC standpoint. I mean, what impact will these changes have in distribution networks? Or what impact will it have on transportation strategies? I mean, what will be new and different moving forward?
Yeah. So first, to mention on the digital transformation, we're a leader in the industry on that, and we're going to stay a leader in the industry on that. And through that transformation, when you think about logistics and these patterns, so more warehousing and different inventory patterns means logistics, it's going to be messy. And what you need to think about is more LTL options and who you're partnering up with from an LTL standpoint, and then incorporating consolidation and deconsolidation into your supply chain network. So freight will transition from long haul, multi-day type of hauls to short haul with much less lead times. That means your transportation strategy and logistics strategy is going to have to change. In today's environment, although we may have felt the market has maybe tempered a little bit, capacity is still a premium in this marketplace. And markets where there are large shifts and the way freight is moving means you're going to have to establish a bunch of new relationships. And especially on the capacity side of the business, because in the reality, Adrian, it's a bunch of small carriers and medium-sized carriers that make up the overall capacity out there domestically. And retailers, when this changes, they're going to have to change their relationships from maybe a few kind of core asset based or third-party logistic-based company to a wider net of logistics and transportation providers. So they're going to have multiple relationships in different geographies, maybe even with different modes, along with incorporating LTL and consolidation. So again, I'll say that is the core of what we do here at Robinson. We aggregate all of that demand from a capacity standpoint, and we leverage that on behalf of our customers. But retailers on the grocery side, they're going to have to think about how that changes their relationships, the people they work with, the technology they're going to have to incorporate, all in this, because that freight and who they have normally dealt with in the past, it's all changing.
It's interesting because I think a lot of times when we talk about transportation in grocery retail, specifically around e-commerce, it's all about the outbound side, right? It's the home delivery of grocery and what some of the key players are doing there, whether they're leveraging their own transportation assets or they're partnering with a lot of these startups that are kind of helping out with that delivery piece. But what you just talked about is, you can argue is just as complex and perhaps even more, because you got to have that product into the stores or that inventory available to be able to fulfill on that. And that part of the supply chain is changing. So that's really what you talked about here is like, hey, the story here is beyond just the home delivery piece and what's going on there, because that gets a lot of the press. I mean, a big part of the story is what happens before the product even gets to the store, in terms of even having the inventory available to do that, right?
Yep. And so micro, meaning you may within geographies have different suppliers that may create the same SKUs for you from a national perspective. But because of the short shelf life, the fact that trans is probably, they may produce at say 3, 4, 5 in the morning. It could be on store shelves by 10 that day. It's just changing everything in terms of who those suppliers are within a certain geography so they can meet the demands. Manufacturing's moving closer to core geographies. Warehousing and logistics has to move right along with it.
Right.
Consumers want that convenience.
No, absolutely. So I think this is a good way to kind of, wrap up now. In light of everything, we kind of talked about, I mean, what action should, grocery retailers and the perishable supply chain, partners to, what action should they take to succeed in this new environment? And what factors will separate the leaders from the laggards in this industry?
So when we've done a lot of work, obviously over the past couple of years here, in the changing dynamics of the marketplace and changing our service offerings to meet that demand out there. In order for them to keep up with the macro expansion of these micro supply chains, really there's three areas that they need to win in. The first is third-party warehousing and partnerships with those warehousing networks. The second one is third-party logistics, because you're going to need a third-party partner in order to leverage all of these different relationships and capacity that are unique to that micro supply chain. And then lastly, you're going to need a technology platform to manage all of these different POs and underlying data to give you a good return on what's going on in your stores. So just to give you kind of a real world example, as we worked with a retailer out west, they wanted to create a store within a store for their perishables, which meant meal kits, all their grab and go, all their online perishable orders would be the store within a store. And they attempted to build it within their current DC network. And what we did is we came in, we gave them a full view what we could do from a micro solution standpoint around their certain geographies. They saw 10% savings in their supply chain cost, and they dramatically reduced shrink. So we set up a whole new third-party warehousing network. We even went DSD with them, and we overlaid that with one complete PO management system. That way, all POs could be tendered outbound to suppliers, inbound to stores, and managed in whether the store order came from, it didn't matter what application platform that came into. And that allowed them to have this full visibility. So solutions are third-party warehousing, third-party logistics, and technology, really to kind of manage it all. Just to really to put a bow tie on it for you, as these supply chains expand and contract, depending on the consumer demands, as micro supply chains become macro in nature, you're going to need really quick turn suppliers, quick turn distribution centers based on geographical pattern that drives convenience for the purchaser, and the right product at the right time for the retailer. So that's kind of the micro part, setting that up. But then you're also going to need a solution to ensure that you're getting the right product, the right time at the right price, and with the right date on it. And that's the macro sense. So to wrap it up, that is what we do here. That's what we do with our managed procurement services. We do that on the supply side of our business, and we marry that up with the logistics side. So as these micro supply chains become more prevalent in nature, you're going to need a macro partner to help you solve them. So I appreciate the time and the questions today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is a topic that I think I might have mentioned this the last time you were on the program. Grocery retailers near and dear to my heart because my dad and my uncles had a bodega, a neighborhood store in Brooklyn when I was growing up, and that's where I worked, as a kid, growing up. And so it's amazing to me to see the transformation that continues to take place in this industry. And as we discussed today, a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. And moving forward, all the stakeholders in this industry are going to have to, the rules of success are changing. So they need to take a fresh perspective. And I think there's going to be, it's going to require stronger, collaboration and synchronization between all the parties involved, to succeed moving forward. Like I always say, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics, but I think we got the conversation started great today, and certainly look forward to, seeing how this continues to evolve in the weeks and months and years ahead. So Todd, again, thank you for making the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So supply chains are adapting, consumers are adapting. We have to adapt along with that. We create solutions for that adaptation, and we're actually excited about all these changes that are going on. It's really good for the industry. The creation of all these new perishable items, the fact that consumers want to eat healthier, fresher type items, and we want to create solutions to get those items into them, so they keep buying them. right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's, again, it's this change that creates excitement, that draws, ultimately it's what makes this industry so vibrant and exciting, and particularly, why I believe it's going to continue to draw, more and more young professionals into the industry, because there's a lot of exciting things, happening here. So again, thank you for joining us. Now, if you're watching this episode on demand at the CH Robinson website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Todd, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
Thank you.